Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we never had with the people we've lost. Brynhild stares at her father's empty chair, wishing she could ask him one last question about the mysterious key he left behind. The old warrior died 3 weeks ago, leaving only a wolf-tooth key and cryptic words about a sealed tower. Now she stands with Einar, a giant Viking who fought beside her father, looking at an ancient stone tower buried deep in the northern mountains. Her father sealed something inside this place before he died, something he said could destroy their world. The tower has waited for years, covered in dragon carvings and old runes that seem to glow in the dim light. What secret was so dangerous that her dying father risked everything to hide it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like an old woman's shawl, refusing to lift despite the sun's gentle insistence. Brynhild pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she walked the familiar path toward her childhood home, each step stirring memories she had buried for 3 decades. The village of Thornwick looked smaller than she remembered, its timber houses weathered grey by countless seasons, their carved eaves still bearing the protective runes her people had trusted for generations. She had not wanted to return. Even now, with her father cold in his grave and his final message burning in her mind, part of her wished she could turn back toward the life she had built far from these northern valleys. But death has a way of demanding answers to questions we thought we had buried. The house stood exactly as she remembered it, though the herb garden her mother once tended had grown wild with neglect. Fennel and yarrow pushed through the wooden fence, and the apple tree her father had planted when she was born now towered over the roof, its branches heavy with fruit no one would harvest. She touched the door's iron handle, worn smooth by decades of hands, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first, leather, smoke, and the faint sweetness of mead that had always clung to her father's clothing. Everything remained precisely where Olaf the Skald had left it, as if he might return any moment from one of his long walks among the stone circles that dotted the mountainsides. His carved chair, blackened with age and use, dominated the main room. His writing table still bore sheets of parchment covered in the angular runes that had been both his trade and his passion. Brynhild approached the table with reverence, her fingers hovering over the pages without quite touching them. Her father had been more than a storyteller, more than a keeper of old tales. In these valleys, a skald held responsibility for preserving not just songs and stories, but the deeper knowledge that bound communities to their land and their ancestors. The runes scattered across his final writings seemed to pulse with meaning, just beyond her understanding. "I wondered when you would come." The voice from the doorway made her turn. Einar Ironson filled the frame like a mountain made flesh, his massive shoulders nearly brushing the carved lintel. At 62, he remained as imposing as the day he had first ridden into battle beside her father, though silver now threaded through his braided beard and laugh lines creased the corners of his grey eyes. He wore simple woolen garments that could not disguise the power still coiled in his frame, and at his side hung the same sword he had carried for 40 years. "Einar," she managed to smile despite the grief that tightened her throat. "You look well, better than your father looked in his final weeks." He stepped inside, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "He spoke of you often, especially toward the end. Said you had his mind, but your mother sensed to get away from this place when you could." The mention of her departure stung, as it always did. She had been 22 when she left Thornwick, tired of her father's expectations and the weight of traditions that seemed to have no place in the wider world. She had made a life among the trading cities to the south, married a good man who asked no questions about her past, raised children who grew up thinking their grandfather was simply a storyteller from a remote village. "He never forgave me for leaving," she said. "You're wrong about that." Einar settled his bulk into the chair across from her father's, the wood creaking under his weight. "Olaf understood why you left. He just never understood why you stayed away so long." The accusation hung between them, and Brynhild could not deny its truth. Pride had kept her away, then stubbornness, then simple habit. The letters her father sent grew fewer over the years, and she had convinced herself that his silence meant acceptance of her choices. Only now did she realize it might have meant something else entirely. "Tell me about his final weeks," she said. Einar's expression grew grave. Something was eating at him, had been for months before he took sick. He spent long hours walking the old paths, visiting places he hadn't been to in years. The stone circles, the burial mounds, the marker stones from the old wars. He would come back from these walks looking haunted, like a man who had seen his own death approaching. The wasting sickness started slow, then came on fast. But that wasn't what worried him most. Einar leaned forward, his voice dropping to the careful tone men use when speaking of things that might be overheard. 3 weeks before he died, he asked me to ride with him to the old tower. "You remember it, the one your grandmother used to warn you away from as a child?" Brynhild nodded. The tower had been a source of fascination and fear throughout her childhood. A crumbling stone structure half buried in a remote valley, covered in carvings that hurt to look at directly. Her grandmother had filled her head with stories about it, tales of ancient kings and older things that should not be disturbed. "I hadn't been there in 20 years, Einar continued. "Your father and I sealed that place after the last of the old troubles, back when we were young and thought we could solve any problem with sword and strength. But when we arrived, I could see that something had changed. The seals we had placed were weakening, and your father, he was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "He wouldn't say exactly, just that something was stirring that should have stayed sleeping. We spent 2 days there, your father working with tools I hadn't seen him use in decades. Carving runes, speaking words in the old tongue, bleeding onto stones that seemed to drink it up like thirsty earth. When we left, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would bring you the key and tell you what he had said." Einar reached into his leather pouch and withdrew an object that made Brynhild's breath catch in her throat. The wolf-tooth key looked exactly as her father had described it in his final message, carved from what appeared to be a massive canine tooth. Its surface covered in runes, so small and intricate, they seemed to move in the lamplight. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and she had the strange sensation that it recognized her somehow. "What did he say?" she asked. "That the work was not finished, that he had done what he could, but that time had run out for him, and that if the old bargains failed, if the things he had bound began to stir again, only someone of his blood could set them right." The weight of inheritance settled on Brynhild's shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear. She set the key carefully on her father's table and moved to the great wooden chest that stood against the far wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, she found what she was looking for: her father's war chronicle, the leather-bound journal he had kept throughout his long life. The pages were filled with his careful script, recording not just the battles he had witnessed and the stories he had preserved, but his personal thoughts and fears. As she read, a picture emerged of a man carrying burdens she had never suspected. Her father had not simply been a keeper of old stories, he had been a guardian of old truths, responsible for maintaining barriers between the world she knew and forces that existed beyond mortal understanding. One passage, written in his final weeks, made her hands tremble as she read. "The signs are all present, the cold that touches nothing living, the whispers in languages that predate human speech, the way the very stones seem to turn away from what lies beneath. I've strengthened what seals I could, but I feel the sickness taking hold, and I know my time grows short. If I cannot finish the work, it will fall to Brynhild. She has the blood for it, though she has never known what that truly means. I pray she will forgive an old man for the burden I may have to leave her. He knew he was dying," she whispered. "The wasting sickness doesn't come on that fast by itself," Einar said quietly. "I think something was drawing the life out of him, payment for the work he was doing. The old magic always demands a price." Brynhild closed the journal, her mind reeling with implications she was not ready to face. Her father had lived and died protecting something, maintaining ancient responsibilities that had now passed to her whether she wanted them or not. The comfortable life she had built seemed suddenly fragile, a beautiful illusion that could be shattered by truths she was only beginning to understand. "The tower," she said. "We need to go there," Einar nodded, though she could see reluctance in his weathered features. "I gave him my word I would help you, whatever that meant. But Brynhild, there are forces in this world that are better left sleeping. Your father knew that better than anyone. Then why did he want me to have the key? Because sometimes, when the old bargains break down, the only choice is between a small disaster and a great one. And because he believed that you, more than anyone else, might have the strength to make the hard choices when the time came." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending autumn leaves skittering across the yard. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, unusual for this time of day, unusual for this close to human habitation. Brynhild shivered and pulled her cloak closer, though she suspected that no amount of wool could ward off the chill that was settling into her bones. She spent the rest of the day going through her father's possessions, each item revealing new facets of the man she thought she had known. Hidden behind loose stones in the foundation, she found tools she did not recognize, implements of carved bone and meteoric iron that seemed to hum with barely contained power. In a secret compartment of his writing desk, she discovered maps marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, showing locations throughout the northern valleys that she now suspected were far more significant than simple landmarks. As evening approached, Einar helped her prepare for the journey ahead. They would need supplies for several days in the mountains, warm clothing, and provisions that would not spoil. But more than that, they would need courage to face whatever her father had spent his final weeks trying to contain. That night, sleeping in her childhood bed for the first time in 30 years, Brynhild dreamed of wolves with eyes like winter stars and voices that spoke her name in languages she did not know but somehow understood. She woke with the taste of copper in her mouth and the certainty that somewhere in the mountains, something ancient was beginning to stir. The wolf-tooth key lay warm against her palm, and she knew there was no turning back. The journey to the tower took them through country that grew wilder with each mile. What began as familiar forest paths gave way to ancient deer tracks that wound between standing stones older than memory. Brynhild had forgotten how the landscape changed as one moved deeper into the mountains, how the very air seemed to thicken with age and the weight of things that had transpired here long before her. People had arrived. Einar rode slightly ahead, his massive frame swaying easily with his horse's gait. He had been quiet since they left Thornwick at dawn, speaking only when necessary to point out landmarks or warn of rough terrain ahead. Brynhild sensed his reluctance, the way a man might feel when returning to a battlefield where friends had died. This was not a journey he wanted to make, but honor bound him to keep the promise he had made to her father. By midday, they had reached the valley. Her grandmother's stories had made famous in her childhood imagination. The Whispering Vale, the old woman had called it, where the wind carried voices from times long past, and wise people learned not to listen too closely. As they descended the rocky slope, Brynhild understood why the place had earned its name. Even in the still autumn air, sounds seemed to echo strangely here, and she found herself straining to hear words in the rustle of leaves and the distant call of ravens. "There," Einar said, pointing toward a rise of land dominated by ancient oak trees. "The tower lies beyond that ridge." But when they crested the hill and looked down into the hidden valley beyond, what they saw made both travelers rein in their horses in amazement. The tower was far larger than Brynhild had expected, not the simple stone structure of her childhood memories, but a massive edifice that rose from the valley floor like a stone finger pointed at the sky. Dragon-headed carvings adorned its surface, their serpentine forms seeming to writhe in the shifting shadows cast by the afternoon sun. More startling still was the great runestone that stood before the tower's entrance. The massive granite slab had not been there in Brynhild's youth, This was clearly recent work, though the runes carved into its surface had the deep, weathered look of ancient inscriptions. As they approached, she could see that some of the symbols were fresh, their edges still sharp from recent carving. "Your father's work," Einar confirmed. Dismounting and approaching the stone with obvious caution, he carved these in his final weeks. "I helped him drag the stone here from the old quarry, though I didn't understand then what he meant to do with it." Brynhild studied the runic inscriptions, her limited knowledge of the old writing allowing her to make out only fragments of meaning. Words of binding, of sealing, of prices paid and bargains struck. But threaded through the formal language of ritual were personal touches that could only have come from her father. Appeals to ancestors, references to bloodlines, and what appeared to be an apology written in the ancient tongue. He was saying goodbye, she realized. Not just sealing the tower, but saying goodbye to us. To this life. The wolf-tooth key grew warm in her hand as she approached the stone, and she noticed that one particular rune seemed to pulse with inner light when she drew near. The symbol was complex, combining elements that represented family, sacrifice, and continuation. Her father had carved it deeper than the others, and she could see dark stains around its edges that might have been blood. "Einar," she said slowly, "what exactly did you and my father seal in this tower?" The big man's face grew grim. "That's just it, I never knew exactly. 20 years ago there were incidents. People disappearing in these mountains, strange lights seen at night, livestock found drained of blood, with no wounds visible. Your father said it was connected to the old wars, to things that had been bound long ago but were working their way free." He gestured toward the tower's entrance, where massive iron doors stood slightly ajar, despite the fresh sealing runes carved around their frame. "We came here with a dozen men, all of them veterans who had seen enough battle not to spook easily. Whatever was in there, they took one look at it, and half of them refused to go any deeper. But you went in. Your father convinced us it was necessary, said that if we didn't act, the problem would spread beyond these mountains, threaten every settlement in the northern valleys. So we went down into the depths beneath the tower, and he paused, his weathered hands clenching into fists. We did what had to be done. Used the old rituals, spoke the old words, paid the old prices. When we came out, your father sealed the entrance and said the danger was contained. But now the seals are failing." "Look around you," Einar said grimly. "The signs are everywhere for those who know how to read them." As if summoned by his words, Brynhild became aware of the unnatural stillness that pervaded the valley. No birds sang in the ancient oaks, no insects buzzed among the late-blooming flowers. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the very air was holding its breath. And beneath her feet she could swear she felt a subtle vibration. Like a great heart beating somewhere far below the earth, the wolf-tooth key was growing uncomfortably warm now, almost hot against her palm. When she held it up to catch the light, she saw that runes along its surface were beginning to glow with the same inner radiance she had noticed in the sealing stone. Whatever her father had bound to this key, it was responding to their proximity to the tower. "We should leave," Einar said, his voice tight with old fear. "Come back with more men, with priests who know the proper rituals. This is not work for two people, especially when one of us doesn't understand what we're dealing with." But even as he spoke, Brynhild was moving toward the tower's entrance. The key in her hand was pulling her forward with a force that felt almost magnetic, and she found herself unable to resist its insistent tugging. Behind her, she heard Einar curse and follow, his heavy footsteps echoing off the ancient stones. The iron doors, which had appeared slightly ajar from a distance, proved to be standing open, just enough for a person to slip through sideways. The gap was too narrow to have occurred naturally. Someone or something had forced them open from within, working against the weight of the metal and the power of the sealing runes carved around the frame. "The seals are broken," Brynhild whispered, running her fingers along the damaged runes. "Not weakened, broken. Something broke out." "That's impossible," Einar protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your father's work was too strong, too carefully crafted. Nothing could have..." His words were cut off by a sound from within the tower, a low, resonant note that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. It was not quite a voice, not quite music, but something that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the part of the mind that remembered being prey to things with sharper teeth and older hungers. The wolf-tooth key was burning hot now, its runes blazing with silver light that cast strange shadows on the carved walls around them. And in that light, Brynhild could see something that made her breath catch in her throat. Footprints in the dust just inside the entrance, leading deeper into the tower. The prints were not human, though they walked on two legs. They were too large, too deep, and they ended in what appeared to be claws rather than toes. "Something came out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Recently, the seals didn't just weaken, they were broken from the inside. Einar drew his sword, the familiar weight of the weapon seeming to steady him. "Then we need to find it and stop it before it reaches the settlements." "No," Brynhild said, studying the key in her hand as understanding dawned. "We need to go in. Whatever broke out, it's not gone. It's waiting. And I think," she paused, the certainty settling over her like a cold cloak, "I think it's been waiting specifically for me." The realization should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange calm descending. Her father had known this would happen. The key, the journal, the careful preservation of ancient knowledge, it had all been preparation for this moment. Whatever lay within the tower, whatever ancient bargain was coming due, she was the payment he had promised. "Your father sealed this place to protect the world," Einar said urgently. "If we go in there, if we disturb what he died to contain, then we finish what he started," Brynhild replied, stepping through the gap in the iron doors. "Because if we don't, I suspect the world is going to have much bigger problems than one broken seal." Behind her, after a moment's hesitation, she heard Einar follow. The tower swallowed them both in shadows that seemed older and deeper than the simple absence of light the interior of the tower defied, expectations in ways that made Brynhild's mind struggle to process what she was seeing. From outside, the structure had appeared ancient but relatively simple, a stone cylinder rising from the valley floor. But within, spiral staircases wound both upward and downward into darkness, and passages branched off at impossible angles that suggested the tower was far larger inside than its external dimensions could accommodate. "The old builders knew arts we've forgotten," Einar muttered, his voice echoing strangely in the vaulted chamber. Space was more flexible to them, more willing to bend to necessity. The wolf-tooth key continued to pulse with silver light, providing their only illumination as they moved deeper into the structure. The strange radiance revealed walls covered in carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, depicting scenes of battles between figures that might have been gods or might have been something else entirely. The non-human footprints they had seen at the entrance continued along the main corridor, accompanied now by other signs of recent passage, disturbed dust, scratches in the stone, and an acrid scent that reminded Brynhild unpleasantly of burning metal. "It went down," she observed, studying the tracks. "Whatever broke out, it came up from the depths." "The sealing chamber was 3 levels below ground," Einar confirmed. "Your father and I spent 2 days there, working the binding rituals. I thought we had contained it permanently." As they descended the spiral staircase, following the creature's trail, Brynhild noticed that the temperature was dropping noticeably with each level. Her breath began to mist in the air, and frost was forming on the carved walls, despite the fact that it was still autumn above ground. This was not natural cold. It was the bone-deep chill that came from proximity to things that should not exist in the world of living beings. On the second level down, they found the first clear evidence of what they were dealing with. A chamber that had once contained her father's research materials had been systematically destroyed, but not by random violence. Books had been opened and their pages studied before being torn apart. Maps had been examined before being shredded. Tools had been handled, tested, and then discarded. Whatever had escaped the sealing chamber possessed intelligence and purpose. It was looking for something specific, Brynhild said, kneeling beside the remains of her father's notes. These weren't destroyed in rage, they were searched. Among the debris, she found fragments of her father's research into the old binding techniques. Pages covered with diagrams of runic patterns and notes about the prices various rituals demanded. One partially intact sheet caught her attention. It contained a detailed drawing of the wolf-tooth key, surrounded by annotations in her father's careful script. "Key to bloodline locks," she read aloud. "Responds only to direct descendant. Required for both binding and release." She looked up at Einar with growing alarm. It wasn't just breaking out, it was looking for information about this key. "About you," Einar said grimly. "Whatever your father bound down there, it knows about his bloodline. It knows about you." They continued deeper, following the trail of disturbance and destruction. On the third level, they found what Brynhild at first thought was another research chamber, but closer examination revealed it to be something far more significant. The room was circular, its walls lined with alcoves containing objects that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Tools, weapons and implements crafted from materials she could not identify lay carefully arranged as if waiting for someone who knew how to use them. "Your father's hidden arsenal," Einar breathed. "I wondered where he kept the tools of the old trade." Brynhild approached the nearest alcove with reverence, drawn by instincts she had not known she possessed. The objects within seemed to call to her, recognizing something in her blood that marked her as their rightful user. Her fingers closed around a set of carving instruments that felt warm and alive in her hands. Knives and chisels made from what appeared to be meteoric iron, their edges gleaming with an inner light that complemented the glow of the wolf-tooth key. "Ancient rune tools," she whispered, understanding flooding through her as she held them. "These aren't just for carving stone, they're for carving reality itself, for writing commands that the world has to obey." The moment her skin made contact with the meteoric iron, visions flashed through her mind, memories that were not her own, inherited knowledge passed down through generations of her bloodline. She saw her father as a young man, learning to use these same tools under the tutelage of his own father. She saw battles fought not with swords and shields, but with words of power carved into standing stones that could turn the tide of war. She saw the long history of her family as guardians, protectors, keepers of boundaries between the world of humans and realms where older things still dwelt. "The bloodline remembers," she gasped, staggering as the visions receded. "Even when we forget, even when we run away, the bloodline remembers everything." Einar steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your father said you had the gift, even if you'd never been trained to use it. The old blood runs strong in you, Brynhild, stronger perhaps than it ran in him." As she secured the rune tools in her pack, Brynhild became aware of a new sound echoing up from the depths below, a rhythmic scratching like massive claws against stone. The creature that had escaped was still down there, somewhere in the darkness beneath their feet, and it was working on something, carving or digging with patient determination. "We need to see what it's doing," she said. Though every instinct screamed at her to flee, "The sealing chamber is just below," Einar warned. "If that thing is trying to undo more of your father's work, then we stop it," Brynhild finished. "Whatever the cost." But as they prepared to descend to the lowest level of the tower, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh scratches in the stone around the chamber's entrance, carved in patterns that looked almost like runes, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to write in the old script without truly understanding its meaning. The creature below was not just intelligent, it was trying to use the same techniques her father had employed to bind it. "It's learning," she whispered. "It's trying to work counter-rituals, to undo the bindings from the inside. How long do we have?" Einar asked. Brynhild studied the crude runic attempts, comparing them to the perfect inscriptions her father had left behind. "It's making mistakes, but it's getting better with each attempt. At this rate," she paused, calculating, "days, maybe hours, before it figures out how to completely undo the remaining seals." The wolf-tooth key was burning against her palm now, its light so bright that it cast hard shadows in the chamber around them. And in that light she could see more of the creature's footprints leading down into the depths, accompanied now by drag marks where it had apparently moved heavy objects. Whatever it was doing down there, it required tools and materials that it was gathering from throughout the tower. "We can't wait," she said, hefting the rune tools with new purpose. "If it completes its work, if it undoes what my father died to accomplish, the old evils will walk free again," Einar finished. "And this time, there may be no one left who knows how to stop them." Together, they began their descent into the deepest part of the tower, following the trail of the thing that should have remained bound. Carrying tools they barely understood toward a confrontation that would determine whether her father's sacrifice had any meaning at all. The deepest level of the tower opened into a vast chamber that defied the structure's external proportions, even more dramatically than the levels above. The circular room stretched away into darkness beyond the reach of the Wolf-Tooth Key's silver light, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. But what drew Brynhild's attention immediately was not the chamber's impossible size, but the object that sat at its center like a fallen star. The memory crystal rose from the stone floor on a pedestal of carved obsidian, its translucent surface pulsing within a light that shifted through colors she had no names for. It was roughly the size of a human head, its facetted surface catching and reflecting the glow from her father's key in patterns that made her eyes water if she looked too directly at them. Around its base, she could see fresh scratches where something with claws had tried unsuccessfully to move or damage it. "I've never seen anything like it," Einar breathed, approaching the crystal with obvious caution. "Your father never mentioned this, because he didn't want anyone to know it existed," Brynhild replied, understanding flooding through her as she drew closer. "This isn't just a crystal, it's a repository, a place where memories can be stored and preserved." The Wolf-Tooth Key grew almost unbearably hot as she approached the pedestal, and suddenly the crystal's internal light flared brighter. Images began to form within its translucent depths, scenes that played out like reflections in still water, showing events from the recent past with perfect clarity. She saw her father as he had been in his final weeks, bent with age and illness, but driven by desperate urgency. The crystal showed him working in this very chamber, carving runes with hands that shook from weakness, speaking words in the old tongue that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with power. His face was haggard, marked by the knowledge that time was running out and the work was far from complete. He was trying to finish something, she whispered, watching the scenes unfold. Some great working that required more time than he had left. The images shifted, showing her father's growing desperation as his strength failed. She watched him stumble and nearly fall while carving a particularly complex runic sequence, saw him lean heavily against the chamber walls as waves of weakness overcame him. But through it all he continued working, driven by a fear that was almost palpable even through the crystal's stored memories. "Look there," Einar said, pointing to a section of the crystal where a different scene was forming. "That's not illness, that's something else." Brynhild followed his gaze and felt her blood chill. The new vision showed her father's final night in this chamber, but he was not alone. Something moved in the shadows beyond the reach of his torchlight, something that watched him work with patient malevolence. As her father carved his final runes, pouring his remaining strength into seals that he knew would outlast his own life, the thing in the darkness grew bolder, pressing against the barriers that contained it. It was feeding on him, she realized with horror, drawing his life force to fuel its own escape attempts. The wasting sickness wasn't natural. It was being caused by proximity to whatever he had bound down here. The crystal's visions continued, showing her father's last, desperate act. As his strength finally failed completely, he crawled to the memory crystal and pressed his hands against its surface. The images showed his life essence flowing into the crystalline structure, preserving not just his memories, but his knowledge, his skills, his understanding of the ancient arts that would be needed to maintain the seals. He turned himself into a living archive. Einar said with wonder and horror. Preserved everything he knew so that someone else could continue his work. So that I could continue his work, Brynhild corrected, for she could feel the crystal calling to her, recognizing her bloodline and offering to share its treasures. He knew I would come. He knew I would need his knowledge to face what he couldn't finish fighting. When she placed her hands on the crystal surface, the sensation was like diving into deep, cold water. Her father's memories flooded through her, not just the recent events surrounding his death, but decades of accumulated knowledge about the old ways, the binding rituals, the prices that various forms of magic demanded. She saw through his eyes as he first discovered the thing that lay imprisoned beneath the tower, learned the true history of the wars that had supposedly ended when she was a child, understood the delicate balance of forces that kept ancient evils from walking free in the world. But with the knowledge came a terrible understanding of what they were truly facing. The thing her father had bound was not simply a monster or a malevolent spirit. It was a fragment of something much larger and more dangerous, a piece of an entity that existed partially outside normal reality. The binding rituals had contained it, but containment was not destruction. And now, weakened by her father's death and the incomplete nature of his final working, the seals were failing in ways that went beyond simple structural collapse. "It's not just trying to escape," she gasped as the visions receded. "It's trying to call its other parts, to reunite the fragments that were scattered and bound long ago." "If it succeeds, how many fragments?" Einar asked grimly. The crystal pulsed again, showing her a map that existed more in concept than geography. A web of binding sites scattered across the northern lands, each one containing a piece of the same vast entity. 7 fragments in total, bound by 7 different guardians over the course of centuries. And her father's was not the only seal that was failing. "The others are weakening too," she said, studying the crystal's revelations. "The death of each guardian weakens the entire network. And there aren't enough of us left who know the old ways to maintain them all. Then what do we do?" Brynhild straightened, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle she had been born to wear. The rune tools at her side grew warm, responding to her newfound determination, and the wolf-tooth key's light steadied into a clear, silver radiance that banished the shadows from the chamber around them. "We finish what he started," she said. "We learn to use the tools he left us. We master the knowledge he preserved, and we find a way to permanently seal what should never have been allowed to exist. And if we can't..." The crystal showed them one final vision, the world as it would be if the fragments succeeded in reuniting, a place where ancient hungers walked free, and humanity existed only at the sufferance of things that remembered when the earth was young and cruel. It was a future that made the current age of war and hardship seem like a golden dream of peace. "Then we die trying," Brynhild said simply. "Because the alternative is unthinkable." The memory crystal's light began to fade as the visions ended, but she could feel its knowledge settling into her mind like sediment in still water. Her father's memories, his skills, his understanding of forces beyond mortal comprehension, all of it was now part of her, waiting to be called upon when the need arose. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber, the sound of claws on stone resumed, closer now and more urgent than before. Armed with her father's memories and the ancient rune tools, Brynhild felt a confidence she had never experienced before as they prepared to venture deeper into the tower's foundations. The knowledge flowing through her mind was vast and sometimes overwhelming, but it came with an intuitive understanding of how to apply it. She could feel the network of binding sites across the northern lands like a web of silver threads, each one pulsing with its own rhythm, each one slightly weaker than it should have been. "There's another level below this one," she said, studying architectural plans that existed now only in her inherited memories. "The true sealing chamber, where the fragment was first bound. That's where we'll find it." Einar hefted his sword, though they both knew that steel would be of limited use against what they were about to face. "What exactly are we walking into?" Something that should never have existed in our reality, Brynhild replied, checking the rune tools at her belt. A piece of an entity that predates human civilization, bound by rituals that require blood and sacrifice to maintain. My father's death weakened the seals, but they should still be partially intact. They found the entrance to the final level hidden behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. But when Brynhild pressed the wolf-tooth key against a seemingly random point on the surface, the stone dissolved like morning mist, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rose from below carried scents of copper and ozone, with an underlying sweetness that spoke of decay. As they descended, the wolf-tooth key's light began to interact strangely with the carvings on the walls around them. Runes flared to life as they passed, creating a cascade of silver fire that followed their progress downward. But these were not her father's runes. They were far older, carved by hands that had worked when the world was younger and the boundaries between realities were more flexible. The original bindings, Brynhild breathed, recognizing the patterns from her father's memories. These were carved by the first guardians, the ones who initially imprisoned the fragments. At the bottom of the staircase, they emerged into a chamber that defied description. The space was circular, but its dimensions seemed to shift depending on where one looked. Pillars of black stone rose from the floor to support a ceiling that was lost in shadows that moved with their own purpose. And in the center of it all, on a dais surrounded by 7 concentric circles of binding runes, stood an object that made Brynhild's breath catch in her throat. The bloodline compass rose from the dais like a crystalline flower, its translucent petals arranged around a core that pulsed with the same rhythm as her own heartbeat. But it was not the artifact's beauty that shocked her. It was its reaction to her presence. As she approached, the compass began to spin slowly, its needle-like petals orienting themselves toward her with unmistakable purpose. "It knows you," Einar said quietly. "It's been waiting for you." When Brynhild reached out to touch the compass, the world exploded into revelation. The artifact showed her the truth of her heritage in a way that the memory crystal's visions could not have prepared her for. She saw herself as she truly was, not fully human, but carrying within her blood the legacy of beings who had walked between worlds when the cosmos was young. Her ancestors had not simply been guardians by choice, but by nature, bred and shaped over generations to serve as living keys to locks that held back primordial chaos. "I'm not just my father's daughter," she gasped as the visions receded. "I'm the descendant of things that were old when humanity was young. That's why only someone of his bloodline could use the key, could maintain the seals. We're not fully human." Einar's expression was unreadable as he absorbed this revelation. "Does it change anything?" "Everything," she replied, studying the compass as it continued to point toward her with unwavering accuracy. "The binding rituals aren't just spells. They're part of what I am, written into my very essence. I don't just know how to maintain the seals. I am the seal in a way. My bloodline is the lock, and my will is the key that keeps it closed." The compass began to emit a low, musical tone that seemed to resonate through the chamber's stone walls. As the sound grew stronger, other artifacts throughout the room began to respond. Crystals embedded in the pillars started to glow. Metal fixtures hummed with harmonic frequencies. And the binding runes carved into the floor began to pulse in rhythm with the compass's song. "It's calling to something," Einar said, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "To the fragment," Brynhild confirmed, her inherited knowledge allowing her to interpret the patterns of light and sound filling the chamber. The compass doesn't just identify bloodlines, it can locate the pieces of the entity that was bound here. And right now, it's telling me that the fragment isn't in its prison anymore, as if summoned by her words. A new sound echoed through the chamber, the scraping of claws on stone, but magnified and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move with purpose. flowing together and taking on a shape that hurt to look at directly. "There," Einar breathed, pointing toward the far end of the chamber where the darkness was coalescing into something that might have been a form. "It's been watching us." The thing that emerged from the shadows was not entirely present in their reality. It flickered between states of existence like a flame in a strong wind. Sometimes it appeared to be a massive humanoid figure with too many joints and eyes that burned like stars. Other times, it seemed to be made of nothing but shadow and malevolent intent. But always, it radiated a cold intelligence that spoke of eons spent plotting its freedom. "You came," it said, and its voice was like the sound of glaciers breaking. "The bloodline calls to me across the barriers, just as it called to your ancestors. You smell of their power, little guardian." Brynhild gripped the wolf-tooth key tighter, feeling its warmth spread up her arm like liquid fire. "You're supposed to be bound. The seals should hold you." "Seals weaken when their makers die," the entity replied, moving closer with predatory grace. "Your father's death cracked the barriers that held me. Soon the other fragments will break free as well, and we shall be whole again. The age of hiding is ending." "Not if I can help it." The compass in her hands began to spin faster, its musical tone rising to a crescendo that made the binding runes throughout the chamber flare with renewed power. And for the first time since entering the tower, Brynhild felt truly prepared for what was to come. She was no longer just a woman carrying her father's tools. She was a guardian, awakening to her full heritage, ready to face a threat that had been contained but never truly defeated. The entity laughed, a sound like winter wind through empty halls. "We shall see, little guardian. We shall see." The entity's presence filled the chamber like poison in a well, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. But as it spoke, Brynhild found herself driven not by fear, but by a growing anger that seemed to come from the very depths of her bloodline. This thing had killed her father by slow degrees, had spent years draining his life force while pretending to be safely contained. The knowledge flowing through her from the memory crystal showed her exactly how much her father had suffered, how he had felt his strength ebbing away night after night while fighting to maintain seals that were never supposed to require such a personal cost. "You murdered him," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building within her. "Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly. You fed on him for months." "I took what was freely given," the entity replied, its form shifting between states of existence like smoke in a wind. "Your father bound me with rituals that required a living anchor. He chose to tie his life force to my prison. When he began to weaken with age, the connection grew stronger, not weaker." Einar stepped protectively closer to Brynhild, his sword drawn, though they both knew it would be useless against something that existed partially outside normal reality. "Why didn't he break the connection? Why didn't he find another way?" "Because there was no other way," Brynhild answered, her inherited memories providing understanding that came with its own burden of guilt. The binding required a guardian's life force to maintain it. He could have passed the burden to someone else of his bloodline, but I was too proud to come home," she finished bitterly. "Too stubborn to admit that this place, these responsibilities, were more important than my desire for a normal life." The entity laughed again, that sound like breaking ice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Pride, the eternal failing of your kind. Your ancestors were proud too when they first bound us. They thought they were saving the world, protecting the weak from forces they could not understand. They never considered that they were simply delaying the inevitable." As it spoke, the shadows around the chamber began to move more purposefully, and Brynhild realized that the entity was not simply talking, it was working, using their conversation as a distraction while it manipulated the binding runes that still held portions of its essence. The patterns carved into the floor were beginning to dim as its influence spread through them like infection through healthy flesh. "Einar, the ancestor mirrors," she said urgently, remembering another artifact her father's memories had shown her. There should be a chamber adjacent to this one, filled with polished metal surfaces. We need to reach them before it finishes corrupting the remaining seals." But the entity had heard her words, and its reaction was immediate and violent. The shadows in the chamber surged toward them like a living tide, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that felt cold enough to freeze blood in their veins. Brynhild raised the wolf-tooth key, its silver light blazing brighter as it pushed back against the encroaching night. But she could feel the artifact's power being steadily drained by the effort. "The mirrors will show you truths you are not prepared to face, little guardian," the entity hissed, as they fought their way toward a passage she could now see was carved into the chamber's far wall. "They will show you what your ancestors really were, what prices they paid for the power to bind us. Are you certain you wish that knowledge?" "I'm certain I wish you returned to whatever hell spawned you," Brynhild replied through gritted teeth, using the rune tools to carve hasty warding symbols in the air. The meteoric iron blazed with its own light as it cut through reality itself, creating barriers that the entity's shadows could not immediately cross. They reached the passage just as the binding runes in the main chamber failed completely. Behind them, Brynhild could hear the entity's roar of triumph as it pulled more of its essence into their reality, its form becoming more solid and terrible with each passing moment. But ahead lay the chamber her father's memories had shown her, a circular room lined with mirrors that reflected more than simple images. The ancestor mirrors rose from floor to ceiling, their polished surfaces showing not the present but layers of truth that existed beneath the visible world. As Brynhild entered the chamber, the mirrors began to activate, showing her reflection alongside images of all the guardians who had come before her. She saw them as they truly were, beings who walked the line between human and something older, carrying within their blood the heritage of creatures that had shaped reality when the world was young. "We're not the first," she breathed, studying the reflected images. "This responsibility, this burden, it's been passed down through dozens of generations, each one sacrificing their normal lives to keep these entities contained. But the mirrors showed her more than just the succession of guardians. They revealed the true cost of the binding rituals, the prices that had been paid over the centuries to maintain the seals. Some guardians had given their lives quickly, burning themselves out in moments of desperate necessity. Others had chosen the slower path her father had taken, allowing their life force to be gradually drained over years or decades. And a precious few, had found ways to pass on their responsibilities without dying, training successors who could take up the burden before it became too heavy to bear. There's another way, she realized. Studying one particular reflection that showed a guardian from centuries past performing a ritual she had not seen in her father's memories. A way to transfer the binding to someone else without dying, without the gradual drain of life force. But it requires... Her words were cut off as the entity burst into the chamber, its form now solid enough to shatter the stone doorframe as it forced its way through. The mirrors around the room began to crack under the pressure of its presence, their surfaces spider-webbing with fractures that seemed to spread through reality itself. It requires a willing sacrifice. From someone of pure bloodline, the entity finished her thought with malicious satisfaction. And there are so few of you left, little guardian. When you die, when your bloodline ends, the seals will fail permanently. We will be free to reclaim what was stolen from us eons ago. Then I won't die, Brynhild said with quiet determination, raising the rune tools as power flowed through her bloodline, like fire through her veins. And I won't let you destroy what my ancestors died to protect. The final confrontation was beginning, and she could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, all the guardians who had made their sacrifices, all the lives that had been given to keep ancient evils bound. She would not be the one to let their efforts come to nothing. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber, just as Brynhild prepared to face the entity in direct confrontation. Heavy boots on stone, accompanied by voices speaking in the familiar dialect of her home village. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the tones. Help had arrived. Perhaps other villagers who had grown concerned about their prolonged absence and followed their trail to the tower. "Down here," Einar called out, his voice carrying up through the passages. "We're in the mirror chamber." The entity paused in its advance, its shadowy form flickering with what might have been uncertainty. Even beings of ancient power could be cautious when faced with unknown variables, and the approach of multiple humans seemed to give it pause. 3 figures emerged from the passage, their faces familiar from Brynhild's childhood memories. Magnus the blacksmith, his broad shoulders made broader by the chainmail he wore. Astrid the herb woman, her weathered hands carrying a staff topped with protective charms. And bringing up the rear, moving with the careful steps of age, but carrying himself with unmistakable authority, was Gunnar the village elder, a man she remembered as her father's closest friend and confidant. "Thank the gods we found you," Magnus said, his relief apparent as he took in the scene. "When you didn't return, when we found signs of disturbance at the tower, we feared the worst. But something was wrong." The realization crept over Brynhild like cold water, starting with small details that didn't quite fit. Magnus wore armor, but not the simple mail a blacksmith might don for protection. This was elaborate metalwork, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Astrid's staff bore charms, but they weren't the healing herbs and protective amulets Brynhild remembered from her youth. These were darker, older symbols that seemed to drink in the light from the wolf-tooth key, and Gunnar was carrying something that made her blood freeze in her veins. A circlet of black metal, twisted and wrong-looking, that pulsed with the same malevolent energy she could feel radiating from the entity behind her. "The betrayer's crown," she whispered, her inherited memories providing identification for the artifact with horrifying clarity. "Gunnar? What are you doing with that?" The old man's expression shifted, the mask of concern falling away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "Doing what should have been done generations ago, child. Ending a mistake that has cost too many lives." "You're working with it," Einar said, his sword already rising as understanding dawned. "You've been working with the entity, working toward the same goal," Gunnar corrected, placing the twisted crown upon his head. The moment the metal touched his brow, shadows began to flow around him like living smoke. "Your father was a fool, Brynhild. A good man, but a fool. He spent his life maintaining seals that were never meant to be permanent, fighting a war that ended centuries ago." The entity behind them laughed, its form becoming more solid as the crown's power flowed through the chamber. "Tell her the truth, old man. Tell her what her precious father never wanted her to know. The things you call entities, the fragments your bloodline has spent generations binding, they're not invaders," Gunnar said, his voice taking on harmonic overtones as the crown's influence spread through him. "They're refugees, survivors of a war that consumed their entire reality, driven into ours by forces that would have destroyed them utterly." "That's impossible," Brynhild protested. But even as she spoke, pieces of knowledge from her inherited memories began falling into place in ways that made terrible sense. The rituals, the bindings, they're to protect our world from beings who never wanted to conquer it," Astrid interrupted, her staff beginning to glow with sickly light. "They wanted only to survive, to find a place where they could exist without being hunted by the things that destroyed their home. But your ancestors, in their arrogance, decided that any foreign presence was a threat to be contained." Magnus stepped forward, his armored hand extended in what might have been a gesture of peace. "We're not here to hurt you, Brynhild. We're here to offer you a choice your father never had. The chance to end this cycle of binding and suffering, to let these beings find the peace they've sought for so long, by releasing them into our world," Einar said grimly. "By letting them do whatever they want to humanity, by letting them exist," Gunnar corrected. "They don't want to rule over humans or destroy our civilization. They want only to be left alone, to rebuild what they lost in their own reality. The bindings cause them constant pain, trap them in states of existence that are torture for beings of their nature." The entity moved closer, its voice taking on tones of what might almost have been pleading. "Your father felt my suffering, Guardian. In the final years, when the connection between us grew strong, he experienced what I experience, the crushing weight of existence in a reality that rejects my very nature, the endless pain of being trapped between states of being. He wept for me in the end, wept for the cruelty he was forced to perpetuate. He was dying because of you," Brynhild said, but her voice lacked conviction. The memories flowing through her from the memory crystal were showing her glimpses she had not noticed before. Moments when her father had seemed to be responding to communication from something else. Times when he had spoken words of comfort to the empty air. He was dying because the binding rituals are inherently cruel, Gunnar said gently. They require a guardian to share their life force with the entity they're containing, creating a connection that causes suffering for both parties. Your father understood this toward the end. He left messages, hidden messages that only someone with access to the deepest archives would find. From within his robes, the old man withdrew a scroll that bore her father's seal. With trembling hands, Brynhild broke the wax and unrolled the parchment, revealing words written in her father's hand that made her world shift on its foundations. "If you are reading this, my daughter, then the bindings have failed, and you have inherited a burden I no longer believe is justified. The entities we have spent generations containing are not the monsters our ancestors believed them to be. They are survivors, refugees from a cosmic war that destroyed their home reality. The bindings caused them constant agony, and maintaining those bindings has cost our family too much blood, too many lives. I lack the courage to break the seals myself, but perhaps you will find the strength to choose mercy over tradition." "This doesn't change anything," Einar said desperately. "Even if they're not evil, even if they're suffering, releasing them could still destroy our world. We don't know what their presence might do to reality itself." "We know what continued binding will do," Magnus replied. "It will kill every guardian in the bloodline one by one until there's no one left to maintain the seals. And then the entities will be free anyway, but they'll be mad with pain and centuries of imprisonment. Is that the future you want?" The wolf-tooth key was burning in Brynhild's hand, its light fluctuating as her certainty wavered. Everything she had believed about her heritage, about her family's noble purpose, was crumbling around her. But looking at the entity, seeing the way it held itself with the careful stillness of something in constant pain, she began to understand what her father had discovered in his final years. "The poison in his system," she said slowly. "It wasn't poison at all, was it?" "A medicine," Gunnar confirmed sadly. "Something to ease the connection between him and the entity, to reduce the shared suffering. But it came too late, and he was too far gone. The damage of decades could not be undone. The betrayal was complete, but it was not the betrayal she had expected. Her father's oldest friend had not conspired against him. He had tried to save him. And now he was offering her the same choice, the chance to end a cycle of suffering that had consumed her bloodline for generations. But was it mercy, or was it the greatest betrayal of all? The chamber fell into a silence so profound that Brynhild could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the cracked mirrors around them. In that quiet moment, with her father's final letter trembling in her hands and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her shoulders, she felt the presence of every guardian who had come before her. They seemed to stand in the shadows beyond the mirrors, waiting to see whether she would honor their sacrifices or declare them meaningless. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Time is something we don't have," Gunnar replied, though his tone was gentle. "The entity has been partially free for days now, and its presence is already affecting the other binding sites. Every hour that passes makes the situation more unstable." Through her inherited memories, Brynhild could feel the truth of his words. The network of seals across the northern lands was like a spider's web with one strand broken. The stress was redistributing to the remaining connections, threatening to bring down the entire structure. If the other fragments sensed weakness here, if they began working to free themselves simultaneously, there would be no way to contain them all. "Show me," she said to the entity. "Show me what you really are, what you were before the bindings. Let me see your true nature." The being's form shimmered, and for a moment Brynhild glimpsed something vast and beautiful, a creature of living starlight and crystalline thought, existing in dimensions that her mind could barely comprehend. It was alien, certainly, but not malevolent. She could sense an intelligence that was ancient beyond measure, but tempered by loss and grief that matched her own. "We were explorers," the entity said, its voice taking on harmonics that spoke of vast distances and cosmic wonder. Beings who traveled between realities, studying the infinite variations of existence. Our home was destroyed by entities that consume entire universes, leaving nothing but void in their wake. We fled here seeking only sanctuary, but your ancestors mistook our desperation for aggression, and the binding rituals were meant to be temporary, Magnus answered. A way to contain us until communication could be established, until terms could be negotiated. But fear won out over wisdom, and temporary containment became permanent imprisonment. Astrid stepped forward, her weathered face creased with sympathy. Your great-grandmother tried to change things, tried to find a way to release the entities safely. She was branded a traitor by her own family and died in exile. Your father found her hidden research in his final years, which is what started his doubts about the righteousness of your bloodline's mission. The revelation hit Brynhild like a physical blow. She had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandmother's disgrace, how she had supposedly tried to weaken the ancient seals out of misguided compassion. But now she understood that the woman had been trying to correct a cosmic injustice, and had been punished for her mercy. "The armor," she said suddenly, remembering another artifact from her father's memories. "There's guardian armor somewhere in this tower. Something that would protect me during the ritual of release. Where is it?" Einar looked at her with growing alarm. "Brynhild, you can't seriously be considering this. Even if everything they're saying is true, releasing entities from outside our reality, the consequences could be catastrophic." "The consequences of keeping them bound are already catastrophic," she replied, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "My father died slowly and painfully maintaining seals that caused constant suffering to beings who never meant us harm. How many more guardians have to sacrifice themselves for a mistake made centuries ago?" Gunnar nodded toward a passage leading deeper into the tower's foundations. "The guardian's armor is in the deepest chamber, along with the other tools needed for the release ritual. But Brynhild, once you begin the process, there will be no turning back. The network of bindings across all 7 sites will begin to unravel simultaneously. Then the other entities will be free as well." "All of them," the entity confirmed. "We are fragments of a collective consciousness, separated by necessity but still connected at fundamental levels. Free one, and the others will inevitably follow. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a mountain. She would not just be freeing a single entity, she would be unleashing 7 fragments of an alien consciousness into a world that had never asked for their presence. Even if they meant no harm, their very existence might change humanity's reality in ways that could not be predicted or controlled." But then she thought of her father's final years, of the pain and weakness that had consumed him as the binding drained his life away. She thought of all the guardians who had come before, each one sacrificing their health, their families, their futures to maintain a prison built on fear and misunderstanding. "The armor," she said firmly. "I want to see it before I make my final decision." They descended through passages that seemed to exist outside normal geometry, following pathways that her father's memories revealed, but that defied architectural logic. The tower was far older than she had realized, built not by her ancestors, but by the original entities themselves, back when they first arrived in this reality and still hoped for peaceful coexistence with humanity. The deepest chamber was a perfect sphere carved from living rock, its walls covered in script that flowed and shifted like water. In the center, on a pedestal that seemed to grow from the floor itself, stood the Guardian's armor. It was not metal as she had expected, but something that looked like crystallized starlight, transparent and beautiful and humming with power that made her bones ache. "It's not armor in the traditional sense," Gunnar explained as she approached the artifact. "It's a bridge between realities, something that will allow you to exist partially in both the human and entity dimensions during the release ritual. Wearing it will let you guide the process. Ensure that the entity's return to freedom doesn't destabilize our reality, or it will kill me," Brynhild said matter-of-factly. "That's possible," Magnus admitted. "The ritual has never been attempted before. Your great-grandmother died before she could complete her research, and no other guardian has been willing to try." Brynhild lifted the armor from its pedestal, surprised by how light it felt despite its obvious power. The moment her skin made contact with the crystalline material, visions flooded her mind. Not memories this time, but possibilities. Futures that might unfold, depending on the choice she made in the next few minutes. She saw a world where the entities were released and found ways to coexist peacefully with humanity, their advanced understanding of reality leading to a golden age of discovery and growth. She saw a world where their release caused chaos and upheaval, where the fabric of reality itself began to unravel under the stress of hosting beings it was never meant to contain. And she saw a world where the bindings were maintained, where guardian after guardian died to preserve a status quo built on suffering and fear. "What would my father want me to do?" she asked the empty air, though she already knew the answer. His final letter had made his feelings clear. He had lost faith in the righteousness of their family's mission and hoped she would have the courage to choose differently. "He would want you to choose based on your own conscience," Einar said quietly. "Not on tradition, not on duty, but on what you believe is right." The entity had remained silent throughout their exploration of the chamber, but now it spoke with a voice that carried the weight of eons. "Whatever you decide, Guardian, know that I bear no malice toward your family or your people. The pain of binding is great, but I understand the fear that created it. If you choose to maintain the seals, I will try to find peace in containment." But that, Brynhild realized, was exactly why the system had to change. No being should have to find peace in imprisonment, no matter how noble their acceptance of it. Her ancestors had made a mistake born of fear and misunderstanding, and the time had come to correct it. "Help me put on the armor," she said to Gunnar, her voice steady with resolve. "If I'm going to do this, I want to do it right." As the crystalline material settled around her body, Brynhild felt herself changing, expanding, becoming something more than human, but not less. The armor was transforming her into a bridge between worlds, preparing her for a ritual that would either free 7 ancient refugees or destroy everything she had ever known. Either way, the age of binding was about to end. The Guardian's armor settled around Brynhild like a second skin, its crystalline surface pulsing with light that seemed to echo her heartbeat. She could feel herself changing as the artifact bonded with her essence, her perception expanding beyond the normal boundaries of human consciousness. The chamber around her became translucent, revealing layers of reality that existed beyond what mortal eyes could see. She could perceive the binding network that stretched across the northern lands. 7 points of light connected by silver threads that pulsed with contained pain. "The ritual requires a focus," Gunnar explained, producing an object that made her breath catch in her throat. The sundering blade was unlike any weapon she had ever seen, forged from what appeared to be crystallized starlight and tempered with forces that existed outside normal reality. Its edge seemed to cut through space itself, leaving brief tears in the air that showed glimpses of other dimensions. "It can sever the connections between realities," he continued, offering her the blade with reverence. "But it can also forge new ones. In the right hands, wielded with the right intent, it can cut through the binding networks and create pathways for safe transition." Brynhild took the weapon, gasping as power flowed up her arm the moment her fingers closed around its grip. Through the armor and the blade combined, she could feel the entity's true nature, not the shadowy, half-formed thing that had appeared in their reality, but the beautiful, luminous being it had been before centuries of imprisonment had twisted its essence. "I can see you," she whispered. "I can see what you really are." "As I can see you, Guardian," the entity replied, its voice now carrying harmonics of gratitude and hope. "Your bloodline burns bright in my perception. You are what we hoped to find when we first came to this reality, a bridge between our kinds, someone capable of understanding both perspectives." But as Brynhild prepared to begin the ritual, she became aware of a new presence pressing against the chamber's boundaries. Something was coming, something that made the entity recoil with what she could only describe as terror. "They followed us," it said, its form beginning to flicker between states of existence again. "The Devourers, the entities that destroyed our home reality. They found us here. That's impossible," Magnus protested. "The bindings would have hidden you from—" "The bindings are failing," Astrid interrupted, her herb-woman's sensitivity to spiritual disturbances making her the first to feel the approaching threat. "And as they collapse, they're creating resonances that can be traced across dimensional boundaries." Through the armor's enhanced perception, Brynhild could see them now, vast, hungry presences pressing against the fabric of reality itself, drawn by the signatures of the entities they had been hunting across multiple universes. The Devourers were not malevolent in any human sense. They were forces of cosmic entropy, existing only to consume and reduce complex forms of existence to base energy. "If they break through," the entity said, its voice tight with ancient fear, "they will not stop with us. They will consume your entire reality, reducing everything you know to raw cosmic fuel." "Then we stop them," Brynhild said with a certainty that surprised her. "We complete the release ritual and get you and your fragments away from here before they can follow." "It's not that simple," Gunnar warned. "The Devourers are already probing the weak points in reality created by the failing bindings. If we sever all the connections at once, we might tear holes large enough for them to enter permanently." "Then what do you suggest?" "A controlled release," Einar said, speaking for the first time since they had descended to this chamber. "Free the entities one by one, allowing them to escape to their own pocket dimension, while we maintain barriers against the Devourers." "That could take hours," the entity protested. "Time we don't have." "I can feel them pressing closer with each passing moment." Through the sundering blade, Brynhild could sense the truth of its words. The Devourers were not just approaching, they were actively working to widen the cracks in reality caused by the failing bindings. Every moment of delay gave them more opportunity to break through. "There's another way," she said, understanding flooding through her as the armor revealed possibilities she had not seen before. "The bindings aren't just imprisoning you, they're also protecting this reality from outside intrusion. If I can modify them instead of destroying them, transform them from cages into barriers, that would require a sacrifice beyond anything attempted before," Gunnar warned. "You would have to anchor the modified bindings with your own life force permanently. It would mean spending the rest of your existence as a living seal between realities. But the entities would be free to exist in a pocket dimension of their own creation, yes. And humanity would be protected from the Devourers by barriers stronger than anything your ancestors ever imagined." The choice crystallized before her with painful clarity. She could attempt a standard release ritual that might save the entities, but doom her world to consumption by cosmic forces of entropy. Or she could transform herself into something unprecedented, a permanent guardian, standing watch between realities, ensuring that both species could exist in safety. "Brynhild," Einar said softly, "there has to be another way, if there is." "We don't have time to find it," she replied, raising the sundering blade as the chamber began to shake under the pressure of approaching Devourers. The chamber exploded into motion as reality itself began to tear around them. Through the Guardian's armor, Brynhild could see the Devourers pressing against the dimensional barriers with increasing force, their hungry essence seeping through the cracks like acid through metal. Each probe sent shockwaves through the binding network, causing the captured entities across all 7 sites to writhe in shared agony. "The heart of ages," she gasped, pointing toward an alcove she had not noticed before. "There, I can see it now through the armor. It's what we need to anchor the new bindings." The artifact that emerged from the hidden alcove defied easy description. The heart of ages pulsed with the combined essence of every guardian who had ever lived, their life forces preserved in crystalline form rather than lost to death and time. It was beautiful and terrible, containing within its faceted surface the accumulated wisdom and power of her entire bloodline. "Your great-grandmother's final gift," Gunnar said reverently. "She created it before her exile, knowing that someday a guardian would need access to the full strength of the bloodline to face an impossible choice." As Brynhild reached for the heart, the Devourers made their first successful breach. A tendril of pure entropy forced its way through a crack in the chamber's wall, dissolving everything it touched into component atoms. The entity that had been their guide shrieked in harmonics that made the stone walls ring like bells, its form beginning to destabilize as it felt the approach of its eternal enemies. "They're here," it said, its voice fracturing into multiple tones. "I can feel my fragments across the network. The Devourers are probing all 7 sites simultaneously. If they break through completely, they won't," Brynhild said with fierce determination, the heart of ages blazing to life in her hands as it recognized her bloodline. "Not while I have breath in my body." Power flowed through her like liquid fire as she connected with the accumulated strength of generations of guardians. She could feel them all, her father, her great-grandmother, ancestors whose names had been lost to time, but whose essence lived on in the crystalline artifact. They had all faced impossible choices, all made sacrifices to protect the world from forces beyond human understanding. "Together," she whispered to the spirits of the past, raising the sundering blade high above her head. "We finish this together." Einar stepped protectively in front of her as another breach opened and a Devourer's probe snaked into their reality. His sword, blessed with runes from his own long service as her father's companion, blazed with silver light as it met the entropic force. The collision sent shockwaves through the chamber, but the blessed steel held, buying them precious moments. "Whatever you're going to do," he shouted over the growing chaos, "do it now." Brynhild brought the sundering blade down on the heart of ages, not to destroy it, but to release its power in a carefully controlled burst. The artifact shattered into 7 perfect fragments, each one shooting toward a different binding site across the northern lands. She could feel them racing through dimensions, carrying the combined will of her bloodline to transform prisons into protections. "The ritual is beginning," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke to realities beyond the physical. Entity of starlight and sorrow, being of distant worlds and cosmic wandering, I offer you and your fragments freedom, but not freedom to wander homeless through the void. I offer you a realm of your own making, a pocket dimension where you can exist in peace while I stand guard against those who would devour all creation. "The price is too high," the entity protested even as its form began to stabilize and heal under the influence of the transforming bindings. "You cannot sacrifice yourself for beings you barely know." "I can and I will," Brynhild replied, feeling the heart fragments reach their destinations and begin their work. Across the northern lands, 6 other entities were suddenly freed from their painful imprisonment, their essence flowing into a newly created pocket dimension that existed parallel to human reality. Because that's what guardians do. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. The Devourers sensed what was happening and redoubled their assault, tearing larger holes in reality as they desperately tried to reach their prey before the entities could escape. But the modified bindings were already taking effect. transforming from cages into barriers that the cosmic predators could not cross. "It's working," Magnus said in amazement, watching through the armor's shared perception as the 7 fragments reunited in their new home. "The entities are free, but the devourers can't follow, because I'm holding the door closed," Brynhild said, feeling the weight of the new binding settling into her very soul. "And I'll keep holding it closed for as long as necessary." The Guardian's armor fused permanently with her essence, making her something more than human but not less, a living seal between realities. A permanent guardian standing watch against forces that would consume everything she loved. The entity and its fragments were free at last, existing in peace in their pocket dimension, while humanity remained protected by barriers stronger than anything her ancestors had ever imagined. The price was her normal life, but the reward was justice served and mercy given. The silence that followed the completion of the ritual was profound, marked only by the gentle humming of reality itself as it settled into new configurations. The devourers had retreated, unable to penetrate the barriers that now protected both dimensions, and the entities existed in peace for the first time in centuries. Brynhild stood at the center of it all, no longer fully human, but not diminished by the transformation, enhanced, expanded, connected to forces that allowed her to perceive the health of both realities with perfect clarity. "It's done," she said softly, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast spaces and cosmic responsibility. "They're safe. We're all safe." Einar approached her carefully, his weathered face creased with concern and wonder. The woman before him was still recognizably Brynhild, but she had become something more, a guardian in the truest sense, forever changed by the power that now flowed through her. The crystalline armor had become part of her essence, visible as patterns of light that moved beneath her skin like captured starfire. "Can you still?" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the question. "Am I still me?" she finished with a gentle smile. "Yes, Einar, I'm still the stubborn woman who ran away from home 30 years ago and took too long to come back. I'm just also something else now, through the transformed binding network." She could sense the entities in their new home, 7 fragments of consciousness reunited at last, working together to build a realm of crystalline beauty where they could heal from centuries of imprisonment. Their gratitude flowed through the dimensional barriers like warm sunlight, carrying with it forgiveness for the long years of misunderstanding. "They want to thank you," she said to Gunnar and the others. "All of you. They understand why the original bindings were created, and they don't blame humanity for the fear that motivated them." "And the villagers?" Magnus asked. "The people who will notice that the old troubles have ended will think that the ancient seals finally did their work perfectly," Brynhild replied. "Which in a way they have, just not in the way our ancestors intended." As they prepared to leave the depths of the tower, she felt a pull toward one final task. In the chamber where they had found the memory crystal, she began to work with tools that existed partially outside normal reality, carving a simple stone marker that would serve as both memorial and message for any future guardian who might find this place. The memorial stone took shape under her hands, its surface inscribed with runes that told the true story of what had transpired here. She wrote of her father's sacrifice and his final doubts, of the entity's long suffering and their peaceful nature, of the choice to transform imprisonment into protection. Most importantly, she wrote of the lesson that had taken her bloodline centuries to learn, that mercy and justice sometimes required the courage to admit when traditions were wrong. Future generations should know the truth, she explained as the others watched her work. If anyone with guardian blood ever comes here again, they should understand that their ancestors were not perfect, that good intentions can sometimes create great suffering, and that it's never too late to choose a better path. The journey back to Thornwick took on a quality of pilgrimage as they climbed from the tower's depths into the autumn sunlight. The world looked the same, but Brynhild could perceive layers of reality that had been invisible before her transformation. She could see the network of dimensional barriers she now maintained, feel the contentment of the entities in their new home, sense the gradual healing of wounds that had festered for centuries. "What will you tell the village?" Einar asked as they rode through the familiar forests of her childhood. "The truth as much as they can accept," she replied. "That the old troubles are ended, that the ancient dangers have been permanently contained, and that our family's watch continues in a new form." They paused at the crest of the hill overlooking Thornwick. The village spread below them like a painting from her youth. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the streets, and life continued in all its ordinary, precious complexity. None of the villagers would ever know how close they had come to cosmic catastrophe, or how a woman they remembered as a stubborn runaway had become their permanent protector. "I won't be able to live among them anymore," Brynhild said with quiet sadness. "My nature has changed too much. But I'll always be watching over them, over all the northern settlements. The Guardian's duty continues, just in a different form." Einar nodded, understanding written in his weathered features. "Your father would be proud. He worried that he was asking too much of you, leaving you with an impossible burden." "He was," she agreed with a soft laugh. "But impossible burdens sometimes lead to better solutions than anyone imagined." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Brynhild felt a deep peace settle into her transformed soul. The entities were free and happy in their pocket dimension. Humanity was protected by barriers that would never fail as long as she existed to maintain them. The cycle of suffering that had consumed her bloodline for generations had finally been broken, replaced by a willing service that brought healing rather than pain. She had lost her normal life, her chance for a simple existence among her own people. But in return, she had gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that she had corrected an ancient injustice and ensured that both species could exist in peace. The memorial stone stood silent in the depths of the tower, waiting to tell its story to future generations. And Brynhild stood guard between realities, a bridge of living starlight who would never let the darkness break through again. Some responsibilities, she had learned, were worth accepting when they served the greater good of all creation.